the R.M.Williams Outback Podcast, bringing to life the characters that feature in Outback magazine and more.
Hello, thanks for joining us. You're with Terri Cowley, Senior Associate Editor of Outback magazine. Recently, we published the R.M.Williams Outback Great Australians magazine, where we profiled 20 legends of the bush. One of those was Tasmanian farmer and farm safety champion Felicity Richards. Felicity manages to combine her various roles with the family cattle business that spans 3 different regions, including beautiful Flinders Island, where she grew up. I'd like you to meet Felicity Richards. For the past 4 years, Felicity Richards has served as Chair of FarmSafe, working hard to raise awareness of safety practices on the land across Australia. She's also Chair of Tasmania's Biosecurity Advisory Committee and sits on the board of directors for Tas Farmers, balancing these roles with managing 3 farms across northern Tasmania with husband Mark and raising 3 children. It's a long way from where Felicity imagined her life as she grew up on a sheep farm on beautiful Flinders Island. Thanks for being on the podcast, Felicity.
Thanks for having me, Terri.
So, Tasmania's largest island had been your family's home since your grandfather received a land grant at Mamana in the island's centre as part of a post-World War II soldier settlement scheme. Despite that heritage, you swore you'd never be a farmer.
Yeah, not crazy. So I grew up loving the Flinders Island community, loving the island life and loving farming. But it looked hard. It looked like a commitment that an 18, 19-year-old version of myself was not ready to make. So I wasn't drawn to farming at that age, at least.
Fair enough. So you went and followed your sister who had studied law in Canberra. Tell me a little bit about that period of your life.
It's quite funny going off to study when you really haven't lived anywhere except Flinders Island and then Launceston in Tasmania. So I went off to Canberra, and in many ways, yes, I was following my sister, but it worked out so well for me because Canberra at that time was such a big country town. I think they still had a gravel car park outside Myers. So it felt right at home. And it was there that I studied law. I got immersed in a very different Australian landscape, both the political environment, but also the physical landscape is so different from Tasmania.
I bet. You completed your law degree and you approached the Ombudsman's office, which sounds like you had a fair bit of front to do that. You sounded like you really knew what you wanted and you pursued it.
Well, the funny thing is this was actually quite early on in my law degree. So it was after doing a unit called administrative law, which most law students certainly at that stage rolled their eyes, and it was one to be endured rather than enjoyed. Didn't have the glamour of doing your first criminal law and that sort of thing. But I loved the idea that there was someone whose job it was to hold government to account, if you like, and that really inspired me. And I pulled out the Yellow Pages, I think it was, and I found the number and I rang the 1-800 number. And they said, the classic, how may I help you? And I said, well, I want to be the ombudsman. And luckily they had a bit of a sense of humour, but I was very fortunate to go and work for their legal director, a man called Paul Bluck, who gave me a job in freedom of information. And that really started me off in a series of government jobs, which I really loved and learnt a lot from.
You moved to Sydney and then you moved back to Tasmania, where your parents now ran a farm near Carrick, 20 kilometres southwest of Launceston. Now, it was here that your outlook on rural life began to turn around.
It really did. I came back a bit lost. I'd been married for a very brief time and realised that was not the choice I thought I was making. Came home thinking, what next? And suddenly farming showed itself to me in all sorts of new possibilities. It was really interesting. It was interesting to me in terms of the work that my mum was doing in the administrative arm of the business and the work that my dad was doing operationally and the farming community more broadly.
So you wouldn't necessarily think a law degree would would prepare you for life on the farm, but it sounds as though it did.
Well, in funny ways it did. The thing I loved about my law degree was it encourages you to think. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about all forms of education is when they inspire you to approach problems and to really think deeply about them. And so, yeah, it didn't have a lot of practical application. I still had to consult YouTube to fix a fence for Dad one day because I was too embarrassed to ring him and tell him I didn't know how to do it.
Thank goodness for YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. Got the job done slowly. Good thing I was on minimum wage, family wage. But I actually went from there. I was finding myself a little bit lonely, loving being on the farm, but a little bit lonely. And I went and volunteered at the local harvest market in Launceston. And it was there that I discovered there were a group of people, an association responsible for running that market. And suddenly my law degree was really useful again, and my work in government was really useful in supporting them to have the right structures in place to run that organisation really well and a thriving farmers market.
It's a great way to meet people and get connected with your community, isn't it, volunteering?
Oh, so good. So good. Yeah, I really believe that.
I think sometimes people in the city forget about that option.
When I was first volunteering, I was setting up and packing down marquees. It wasn't particularly special or exciting or glamorous work, but I met a lot of other lovely volunteers and I felt that I was making, just in my own small way, a contribution to my community that was, you carry that with you. It makes you feel good about it.
And it's a harvest market. That's also connecting you back to farming as well.
It was, and it was a new angle to farming because this is a lot of producers who are really doing that paddock to plate. They're there with their own produce, their own labours are right there on display. They're talking to the consumer about how to cook their product, how they made it, how they came to share that food or produce with the consumer. And I really liked that. It was really interesting. And there were very different perceptions of what farming was when I started to mix with that community of consumers and farmers.
What sort of products were you seeing at the market at that time?
Lots of lovely things, from gins and ciders to fruit and vegetables. I always particularly loved it in summertime when we got all the berries. Like, that was just heaven. I was very happy to queue for 40 minutes for cherries, but I won't park more than 2 minutes away from where I want to be now. That's unfortunately where Tasmania's trained me to do. Interesting things too. Like, I remember someone turning up with avocados. They actually retired. They were from Western Australia, I think, and they were avocado farmers. They'd come to Tasmania to retire and realised that they could grow avocados here, and why the heck not? There was someone growing celeriac, and they had a store where they had to explain to people, A, what celeriac was, and B, how to cook it, or they didn't find themselves selling a lot of product. And I just loved those things. It was really great, really interesting.
So 12 months after returning to Tasmania, your dad received a phone call from a neighbour informing him that his cattle had gone through their shared fence. And you and your sister set out on horses to bring the animals back, thinking that maybe you'd meet this crusty old farmer on the neighbouring property. Well, that's not what happened. Tell us what happened.
Not exactly. I do still laugh at myself and my sister and I riding out there. Oh, yeah. We're going out there and we're like, oh, nice horse ride, but here we go. We'll go meet the neighbour. And he's just a bit of a hottie, Terry. There's no two ways about it. My now husband he was actually angle grinding the padlock. There was an old chain on the gate between the two properties, and he was fixing that. And I sort of thought, oh, that's unexpected. And funnily enough, what drew me to him was he had two working dogs with him who I now know as Bon and Frankie, and they just were so thrilled. They had that working dog joy of, we're with the boss, we are having the best day of our lives, because every day with the boss is the best day of our lives. And I thought, well, he must be a good bloke. His dogs love him.
More than a decade on, you now, as I said, I think earlier, now run 3 properties dotted across Tasmania's north. Tell me a bit about those properties and what you are doing on them now.
We're an all-beef enterprise, much though I grew up on a sheep farm. Mark doesn't have a lot of time for sheep, and it's no good ever trying to farm something you're not passionate about. It's got to be a labour of love. And We now have roughly 6,000 to 7,000 head of mostly Angus across our 3 properties. So we're very lucky my parents passed management of the Flinders Island property that I grew up on to us. We own and lease some land quite close to Launceston, and then we have a 3rd property up in the northwest, not far from Wynyard. The Flinders Island property is really breeding. It's just a breeding operation here near Launceston and up in the northwest. I call it opportunistic trading. So not traders in the strict sense, but where we see opportunities, we might buy in some cattle and fatten them for sale. Our approach is to try and keep things of like a really simple operation. So good infrastructure, simple structures in place to make sure it's really efficient and that our animals have the best possible lives they can, and that our environment is really, I would say, I think sustainability really gets overused, but it probably is the right word. We want a farm that will prosper under our care and prosper for many, many generations to come, whether they're our family or someone else.
So Mark is operational manager and you are leaning more into the admin.
Yeah. There's shared decisions at a sort of high level, like employing staff and making decisions about big infrastructure and things like that. But overall, we sort of have our own lanes and try and make sure that we're doing our part and coming together where we need to be across each other's, what's happening in each other's field, so to speak.
Given that this is a audio medium that we're in now, and we do hope that people will pick up a copy of our Great Australians publication and have a look at your lovely face and your surroundings. But can you perhaps describe for those listeners the environment? Now, I'm wondering, is there a big difference between the environments on the mainland where you're working and on Flinders Island? Because the idea of having a farm on Flinders Island does really just sound very idyllic. And I'm picturing the colours of Flinders Island, those blues and those sort of ochres with the lichens and the green grass. Yeah. Is that what it's like?
It is very beautiful. And they are quite different environments. I think that's what makes it interesting. And also, I think you take for granted how well you know your land. Like, it wasn't until we took over on Flinders Island and I realised that, my dad was this resource that had known that land for over sort of 50 years. I mean, that's so valuable. Someone who'll tell you, oh, be careful in that paddock. I remember him telling us, for example, there's a really great section of the farm that's really productive. And he said, just be really careful. If you graze that out too hard, you'll have a salinity problem and it will take you the best part of a decade to fix it. Like, just little insights that you're not going to know unless you've got that history of the land.
Someone who's lived it.
Yeah. And it's a gentler climate there. We actually carve earlier there. We start carving in August because we just don't get the heavy frosts and we simply don't get the cold weather. You get a cold wind, certainly, but it's a more forgiving climate and we average about 750 mils over there. So there's no irrigation whatsoever. And all our water tends to come from bores into a kind of limestone substrate, I guess, and we pump up from that into a reticulated water system. Near Launceston, I had a friend once say to me, she's a vegetarian, and she said, what would you grow on your land if you weren't growing beef? And I said, mate, it's rocks. Like, it's lovely for grazing, but if you wanted to plant a fruit or a vegetable here, it'd be really, really hard going, because when we start to sell rocks, we're going to be gazillionaires. But until then, the land is really well suited to grazing, but it's a lot colder. So we start carving later. The property up in the northwest is, again, different. Huge timber, incredibly fast season. It's the only one where we routinely make hay because we simply can't carry enough stock to eat that spring feed. So, and it's the one we're still learning. We've had it for 6 years or so now, but we're still learning the way that land behaves, how it needs to be cared for to make sure it does the best it possibly can. So, it's all an adventure.
And where are you spending most of your time? Where's home?
Near Launceston. So our Launceston home block is where we're based most of the time. Try and get at least a few weeks on Flinders with the kids every year. That's always really, really special. I've been asked to open the Flinders Island show this year, and I'm incredibly honoured and excited to be invited to my home community to do that.
It must be lovely to take your children back to where you grew up and let them have, that not exactly the same as what you had, but to become familiar with that land.
It is. It's really good.
So you've got the 3 children now. Correct me if the ages have gone up since we published Great Australians that you featured in. Elizabeth, 10,
Yes,
Esme, 8, and John, 6.
that's right.
They will come into the story a bit more in a minute. I mentioned at the outset that you had been chairing FarmSafe for 4 years. Can you tell me about that organisation and what it does? I mean, there's a clue in the title, I get that, but
A lot of people accidentally think it's a regulatory body, and it's far from it. So it's great to explain what it does. FarmSafe Australia is a not-for-profit organisation. It's national, and it has a very simple mission, and that's to reduce the number of fatalities and injuries on Australian farms. We have lots of member organisations, so organisations that are our farmer peak bodies, our commodity organisations, they are our members. And with them, we try and share as much information and as much support as we can with farmers about how to make their homes and workplaces as safe as possible.
now I'm sure you can quote me some statistics about some of the disturbing statistics about some of the accidents on farms that we sort of accept as being part of farm life, and I'm sure you would argue that we shouldn't be accepting that.
Far from it. One thing that became apparent to us this year is over the last 6 years or so, we're averaging about 1 death on an Australian farm every 6 days. And when I realised that, it renewed, if you like, all my commitment to trying to see those numbers change. Because there is a tendency, I think, for people to say farming is risky. It's inherently risky, and farmers themselves have a very high risk threshold because they have to. They're working in an environment that they don't have a lot of aspects of it, they don't have a lot of control over. But I don't put safety in the same bucket as I put the weather. There are lots of things we can do to make safer decisions on farms, and what I want to see is a downward trajectory on those numbers. And we tend to average around mid-50 fatalities on Australian farms year in and year out. And that's what I desperately want to see change in a really meaningful way.
So at the moment, you're pushing hard on helmets and seatbelt use on side-by-sides.
We really are. And sometimes I think the notion of improving farm safety can seem quite overwhelming to people. So on our own farm, when we talked about it here, suddenly I realised it didn't have to be complicated. I already know the statistics. We are most likely to have someone killed or injured in one of our side-by-side vehicles or a tractor. So straight away, right, just go in, laser focus. What are the things that we can do to improve everyone's safety around there? And some of the things that we've done, and FarmSafe encourages people to do, is it is mandatory to wear a helmet and a seatbelt, not in the tractor with the helmet, obviously, but with the seatbelt. And we introduced a speed limit on farm because speed plays another very significant part in our accidents.
They are things that take a little bit longer, but I guess, as you say, as you embed them and they become part of routine, you just do them, hopefully, just as a matter of course.
And you don't even notice it. I think about the generation that saw the introduction of the seatbelt. It would have felt really annoying to start with. And now it almost feels odd if you're not wearing one.
Well, your car will beep at you, won't it?
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need beepers on side-by-sides.
And absolutely, whatever it is, a lot of our technology is there to remind people, but we have to make sure we don't go out of our way to avoid it, that we let it do what it's intended to do, which is to remind us to wear a seatbelt.
A few years ago, you had an experience involving your children that really brought the reality of farm safety close to home. Can you take me back to that day and what occurred?
It's a story about our middle child, Esme, and at the time she was probably about 2, or actually she would have been a little bit younger because our youngest was not born at that time, so she would have been between 1 and 2 and her sister between 3 and 4. And I was pregnant and tired and thinking, I'm going to brush my horse today. That's my achievement for the day. I've been around horses since I was a child, and I tied the horse up, reminded the girls not to walk too close behind the horse, had them close to me, thinking this is just a lovely shared moment with the animals and my children.
And you were well aware of the safety around horses.
Yeah, exactly. And that was where my focus was. And I thought, yep, I've got this situation covered. This is lovely. Barely 5 meters away was a water trough. And I'm oblivious to it in this task. And a few moments, who knows, 5-10 minutes after we'd been standing there, Elizabeth, not yet 4, says, Mum, Esme's in the water trough. And I looked, just glanced to my right, and there she is. She's not even 2, and she's toppled face forward into the water trough, and her little legs are too short to still touch the ground, and her arms are too long to touch the bottom of the trough. So she's trapped almost like on a pendulum. She's just trapped like a seesaw on the edge of the trough. I didn't hear her go in. I didn't hear her splashing when she was in there. And I remembered, even in that moment, people saying you won't hear a child drown. But I didn't realise how true that was. Now I grabbed her and she was indignant and cold and spluttery and completely unharmed. And I was just appalled. I couldn't believe I hadn't even noticed such a significant and well-known hazard within tottering distance for a toddler of where I was standing. The other big lesson for me that came home through the work that I've done with FarmSafe is learning that what we know about child fatalities on farm is where they can ascertain whether there was active supervision. It's about 64% of cases they know there was no supervision. Now, I would have said to you before that day I was supervising my children, and unfortunately it took that incident for me to realise I wasn't. It's the equivalent to, reading a book while your kids are in the pool. You're not actually supervising them because it's so quiet and so fast. You're going to have your eyes and your mind on their movements to really be actively supervising them. So there were some very, very big lessons for me that day.
What do you do in that situation?
The water troughs are there for the stock to drink from, so we simply, the only thing we can practically do is, if we're near a water source with the kids, it's phone away, it's booked down, it's not brushing the horses, it's right there concentrating on what they're doing. Interestingly now, if we go down to the river, my parents live on the river, and if we're down at the river, my kids will have a flotation device on, even though they're all swimmers, because I'm conscious that if they hit their head and go under, I can't see them, and it gives me the chance to get to them if they fall in and for some reason get caught.
Yeah, it's not like a backyard pool.
Yeah, it's funny. There's steps that I've taken, and if you can't be actively supervising, the child has to be in a place where risks like that are not available to them. It really does come down to that.
So you've said this is your final 2-year term at FarmSafe, and that your time at the Biosecurity Advisory Committee is also coming to an end. Tell me about the Biosecurity Advisory Committee.
So that one I actually have concluded my term on now at the time of recording. That was a appointment by the Tasmanian government to provide advice to the government and the department on all things biosecurity. It was an opportunity for the government to hear from a whole range of different people across industries. So the marine environment, our natural resource management, our agriculture, about biosecurity concerns. It was a really, really interesting and rewarding space to be in.
What would you say is the top biosecurity concern in Tasmania at the moment?
As of today, like most of Australia, it would be preparing for bird flu. And I have to say that when I spoke to the new chair, Lloyd, I said, I'm really handing the baton to you at a tough time, Lloyd, and I'm very glad that he's stepping in there as a former vet. He has a wealth of expertise to offer on what's going to be a very tough time across Australia.
Have there been any cases in Tasmania yet?
Not that I'm aware of yet. And as we come into nesting season and things like that, for I'd say the last couple of years, it's been a case of when, not if. So it's just a case of being well prepared and making sure the community is really well prepared and understands.
This means you're a bit freer for some new opportunities perhaps, and judging from what you've been doing over the last couple of years, I don't think you're going to be resting on your laurels.
It's actually really interesting. Just very recently, I've had cause to pause together with my husband and reflect on how much I'm taking on. And I've made the decision to step back from some of my other activities. I'm still sticking with FarmSafe. It really is something that I love. But it can be easy to keep taking new things on because I've loved everything I've done. Not every moment, but overall, I always really enjoy the things that I've been involved with. But also it's nice to step back and take a moment to pause and decide where to next. What I have really enjoyed doing too is remembering that sometimes there are things that I want to do myself, one of which is last year I organised a low-stress stock handling school for kids. And that was such a lovely thing to do, and it was so rewarding to see young people learning, really young. Our youngest participant was 6, and seeing this kid learning how to move, sheep and cattle through paddocks and sheep yards, and seeing Bruce's satisfaction as he learned to do this was so great. So I'm actually in the process of organising one of those again and would love to continue to do that. So never a dull moment.
And you've also got a particular interest in farm waste. Where does that come from?
Baby boomer parents, maybe? I think I just find it frustrating. I think watching the shift, I watched a movie recently and they had polystyrene cups. And I was like, oh, yeah, polystyrene cups, they were such a thing. And now you wouldn't see a polystyrene cup anywhere in Australia. And I feel like where there's a will, where there's a public determination to make a change, it'll happen. And I'd love to see that same determination happen to silage wrap. I'd love to see it happen to our chemical containers. I'd love to see it happen to hay wrap. All those things that I look at and think, where there's a will, there's a way. Surely we could be doing something more in that space. So, yeah.
Can you imagine how much of that stuff is actually just sitting on farms?
I know. Someone said to me reasonably recently, industrial scale consumerism requires industrial scale agriculture. And it's a bit of an intimidating thought, but at the same time I thought we've just got to be really smart. We've got to be thinking about how we make sure that our impact is how we just mitigate against those things and make sure that we're addressing them. Doesn't mean you stop making silage. It just means you get really smart about what we're doing.
Is the answer perhaps in biodegradable packaging?
I love the idea that cows could actually eat the wrap. What if you could wrap it in? I'm not a scientist, but I look at all the amazing products, molasses flavored.
Yeah.
But look at all the different takeaway things now that are all compostable materials and stuff. And I think we absolutely should be able to do this.
So, Felicity, I met you recently at the Australian Women in Agriculture National Conference in Orange, New South Wales, just a couple of weeks ago. Do you think women in ag are having a bit of a moment?
I hope so. I hope that they are in some ways becoming more visible in a role they've always had, which is integral to agriculture. I know that as we speak, it's census night. And I hope that many people on farms, maybe like me in the past, they wouldn't have written farmer if they did the admin side of the business because maybe they carried that perception of the farmer as the person out in the paddock on the tractor. I love writing farmer. Absolutely. I'm like, yeah, I'm a farmer. Trust me. I'm always teasing our suppliers. You won't get paid unless you talk to me. So there's no good just talking to him, my husband. The business is only half half what happens out there. And I think we should carry that with pride and make sure it's acknowledged.
I think you're right that, the reality that has always been there is coming to the fore, but I think equally more women are being attracted to agriculture. I certainly spoke to several of them at that conference, young women, and they were saying that females were dominating their agriculture degrees. So we are going to see a big shift in the future, I think.
I think I've heard something similar about vets. I think there's a lot of women coming into agriculture and its surrounding industries, if you like, and that's just fantastic. It is such a great place to be. I would hope that anyone and everyone looks at agriculture and sees a possibility of something that would be their place.
Well, that seems like a positive note to end on.
That's a nice note to end on.
It is. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, and we look forward to hearing what you do next. Thank you again for being on the podcast, Felicity. It's been a pleasure to meet you recently and a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thanks, Terri.
Terri back again. Thanks for listening to this interview with Tasmanian farmer Felicity Richards. You can read Felicity's story in the latest issue of R.M.Williams Outback Great Australians magazine, available from good newsagents or directly from us at www.outbackmag.com.au. Of course, you can also subscribe to our bi-monthly Outback magazine at the same place. Felicity's story was written and photographed by Andrew Bain. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, Terri Cowley. Editor-in-Chief is Mark Muller. Design and marketing support from Claire Das Nevis. Original theme music by Isaac May.